Hello and welcome to the Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlight. I'm Sheila Averbuck, the social media manager for the prize. I'm delighted to see a lot of you logging in to watch this live. If you have any questions for this week's author, please do let me know in the comments. I am absolutely thrilled to introduce the author of The Magician and many other books, Colm Tóibín. Colm, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Absolutely delighted to have you here. You have written a number of books, been shortlisted for the Booker 3 times. This fantastic book has already won the Rathbones Folio. How did you feel when you heard that it had been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize?
I felt great because this book did require a huge amount of historical research, and I was trying to imagine what it was like to be in Germany in 1914 when the war broke out and feel patriotism, feel a sort of almost Thomas Mann feeling sort of militaristic at that time, and then those feelings dissolving really by 1919, 1920. So you're talking about trying to imagine the sort of fervor of German patriotism um, from the English language side. That's quite a leap. It just requires a lot of reading and thinking. And then, of course, the whole idea, which we still haven't come to terms with, as to how Hitler rose in plain sight, but people saying afterwards they just didn't realize how it was going to happen. So trying to get Thomas Mann's life in these years, especially, um, and also when the news of the Holocaust came, how it came, how people slowly realized the enormity of what had occurred. So yeah, so oddly enough, even though it's the second half of the 20th century, or it's the 20th century, it's an historical novel, and so I was sort of delighted to have this recognized as something that really is a different genre and requires a different sort of approach if you're writing the book.
You had to read an enormous amount, I imagine, for this. Out of the huge amount of material there is out there by Thomas Mann, about Thomas Mann and his family, which of it all unlocked the man for you?
There's a wonderful book called Unwritten Memories by Thomas Mann's widow, Katia.
Katya.
She dictated the book. She's very old at this point. She's in her early 90s, and she dictates a sort of memoir. And it's so good humored and tolerant and observant and loyal to him at the same time as being amused by him as well. And it paints a picture of her, which I particularly needed for the book, because her letters to him, written from the sanatorium in Davos before the First World War, are missing. So we don't have her voice as we should have. If those letters were there, we would see how much she contributed to his novel, The Magic Mountain, but they were lost in the war. And so this book becomes really important to give us a picture of what an extraordinary marriage it was. And part of the reason was that she was extraordinary, that she was the one who brought a sort of, she was wiser than he was, and in certain ways more intelligent. And she certainly enriched his life. And my novel, is a portrait of a marriage as much as anything else. And, she was in Venice with him, in 1911, when he based his death in Venice on that journey. And she said, yes, there was a boy, and Tommy was watching him on the beach. So, you get a lot of information as well from that little book. It's a tremendously good book.
Were you ever tempted in any of your research to make anyone else other than Thomas Mann the focus? And what by that I mean Katya or Erica and Klaus, or was it always Thomas for you?
Yeah, it was always Thomas. I liked his ability to withdraw, and I liked his ghostly presence sometimes, where everyone else is making noise, everyone else is arguing, everyone is shouting, his daughter, his son, his wife, his brother. A lot of the time he's silently watching them, and he's in another world a lot of the time. And so I needed that. That's always there. He's always a sense that for 4 hours every morning, he is making up his own world. He's imagining things. And the rest of the day, he's in a state sometimes of recovery, but also he's not fully present in his own life. I was trying to get a character. It's not a man without qualities as much as a man who is not fully present in his own life. And I wanted to get this into the book. So it was essential that he's at the very center of the book, even though other characters in the book are more colorful than he is.
So we may have people watching who haven't read anything by Thomas Mann. I should have asked you this at the first, but Can you tell us who is Thomas Mann and why did he fascinate you?
He was born in Lübeck, which is near Hamburg, in 1875. He was the second son in a family of five. His father was a senator, and was involved in import-export business with ships, with warehouses, the family business going back generations. His mother had been born in Brazil, and there was a lot of trade between Lübeck and Brazil. Her father was German, but her mother was Brazilian, meaning she was of mixed blood. And so he was when he was a teenager, his father died. The family business was wound up. The family moved. His mother and his siblings moved from Lübeck to Munich, which was a huge move in these years. And
they're very far apart. I hadn't realized how far down Munich is.
Yeah, but you see, since Germany was really united only in 1871, that the movement from an all Protestant, mercantile, very, very conservative place down into Munich, which had a Jewish population, had a large, obviously Catholic population as a capital of Bavaria. It was also a much more cosmopolitan city with a big, university and artists, and so it was a completely different world. It isn't merely that he saw nuns on the street, which was such a shocking thing, because in Lübeck you didn't see Catholic clergy, but you saw a lot of young poets and a lot of that sort of flaneur thing that no one in Lübeck walked anywhere without a good reason. So he published his first novel when he was very young. He finished it when he was 25. It was called Buddenbrooks, and it remains to this day, I suppose, a great 19th century blockbuster novel. It was the novel that was cited in his Nobel Prize citation in 1929. And it tells the story of his family going back 3 or 4 generations. In other words, the very thing that was lost, which was his Lübeck, that mercantile world, is revived and is the theme of the novel Buddenbrooks. And he wrote famously Death in Venice, but also The Magic Mountain, the big novel about the sanatorium. And at the end of his life, he wrote a novel called Dr. Faustus, which is about a German composer in the early years of the 20th century. He became a sort of an implacable enemy of Hitler, but he wasn't always left-wing. He was a much more conservative figure, but Hitler appalled him eventually. And he went into exile in 1933 and stayed out of Germany, first in Switzerland, then in France, and then in America, in Princeton, and then in California. And he left America in 1952, and he had 3 more years to live. He died at the age of 80 and went back to Switzerland, where he spent the last 3 years of his life.
He seems like such an unlikely person, of all the people in that family, of him and his siblings, to become a blockbuster novelist. He seemed so, buttoned up, for lack of a better word.
Buttoned up is a good word. His public persona was that he was scholarly and serious, and his speeches went on at some length. But actually, he was much more insecure when we see from his diaries. In his will, he said his diaries were to be published 25 years after his death. And they were explosive because they dealt with the thing that he himself in his life kept secret, which was his secret erotic life, which was effectively homosexual. So he would be giving a lecture, and there would be vast numbers there. He would be all scholarly, but he would be thinking about a boy in the 3rd row, or a young man sometimes in the 3rd row. And he would go home in his diaries and he would write that down, that erotic charge coming from a single gaze, a single glimpse. And so yes, that the idea that he could hit the spot as a popular novelist is very strange, because he was quite a stiff, distant figure. But his first novel, Buddenbrooks, was a novel that people continue to read to this day. But in the early years of it, after its publication, it really did become a sort of widely read and much loved novel. And so he's a mixture. That's what interests me. There's an ambiguity in everything. You can never pin him down. You can never say something about him that's entirely true, because often the very opposite is also true.
There is this wonderful scene early on where he hasn't yet made it, but he's basically announced to his mother, I'm going to go be a writer too. You need to support me the way you're supporting my brother. And he and his brother sitting opposite each other with desks in Italy, and they're both trying to be writers, just aspiring. It looks like dueling banjos.
Yeah, it never stopped the sibling rivalry. It went right through into California into the late 1940s. But yeah, in these early years together, they do go to Palestrina in Italy, and they do share a room, and they don't share sleeping quarters, but they share a room to work in. And they're both attempting to deal with the Germany that they knew when they were growing up, which is obviously dissolving with German unification, but also they've lost it. That the Lubeck is a small city, so they would have been noticed on the street. Everyone would have known that's the senator's son, that's the senator's son. And whereas in Munich, nobody knew who they were. So that they were both attempting the same thing. And then Thomas was the one who wrote the novel, which became the big success. Heinrich had his success too, because he wrote the novel on which the Blue Angel, the film, is based. So that he had his successes as well. They were a famous pair, the two of them.
Would you like to do a little reading now?
Yeah, this is just from the very opening of the book, and it's Thomas Mann and his siblings are listening to their mother. So his brother is Heinrich, and in the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their night clothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, what they were like, or what languages they spoke. A country many, many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter, and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine, and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reach back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did, and they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty in Brazil was on the water, his mother would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible like the sun during the day. They are small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said that you could read a book in the upstairs rooms at night because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. And you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us the story of the sugar. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they are eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? Thomas asked. You must ask your father that.
I love that. The family gets a real shock, don't they, when the father dies, and essentially the father has not treated them very well in his will, has he? He's just...
Yes, it was one of those periods when you could write punitive wills with a commentary on each person in your family. This is obviously, for very good reasons, died out, but he could still do that in the 1880s in the north of Germany, and a commentary on each of his children and how he thought they what sort of control they would need. So his widow felt deeply humiliated in that, there were all sorts of guardians put in place over the children, over her finances, and so it was it was a punitive Northern European Protestant thing to do.
The nickname, the magician, there's actually lovely stories there about how he comes to have that nickname within his family. Why is he the magician for you? Do you think that's an apt title for him?
No, I don't. It's ironic. In other words, his children called him the magician as a joke. That his son had a nightmare, and his father came and banished the figures in the nightmare and said, "I'm a magician. I can do this." And in the morning, then they called him the magician, Zauberer. The Z and Z. And so often in letters, they just refer to him as Zed. But as they got older and as he got older, he seemed more and more stolid to them. I mean, less and less a magician and more a sort of respectable man. Well, they went around the world doing as they pleased. The old magician stayed home. And he performed his magic in his own way in his books, but his books are, he does tend to anchor his books in the real world. It's not as though he wrote fantasy. So the title, The Magician, is there in some way or other to suggest that it was a joke, and it became a bigger joke as they all got older to call him magician, you know.
As I don't know about being a magician, but I certainly felt that he nearly had this charmed life, that somebody was always there protecting him, guarding him from the consequences of things, right from that first schoolboy that he fancied, who kind of looked out for him, and right up to Agnes Mayer, whose husband owned the Washington Post, literally shepherding him out as Europe is coming crashing down during World War II. And I don't know, did that strike you, that he always seemed to exist in this orbit of being protected?
Yes, I have a sort of ethical problem around writing about the Germany of this period. That it seems to me that there's a great deal of work still required by historians, and for a novelist to intervene. In other words, that the things that I'm interested in, irony, comedy, ambiguity, melancholy, don't lend themselves to this particularly brutal period in history. And the problem is, if you try and bring these things into that world, you are in some way defacing a great amount of astonishing suffering. And therefore, the fact that he's privileged matters to me. In other words, I have found somebody who had an oddly charmed life in this period. His own sufferings were minor compared to the great sufferings. And yes, you're absolutely right. He never ran out of money, for example. He married a very rich woman. He himself, his books always sold. When they closed him down in Germany, it opened things up for him in America. You're absolutely right that when he went to America, Agnes Mayer really took him over and bullied him and bossed him, but also protected him, got visas for him, got jobs for him, and his publishers in New York did the same thing. His wife, constant care. I mean, the constant care of a most intelligent, ironic, interesting, tolerant person. So, yes, he was always looked after, and he always managed to escape. He was always 2 steps ahead of the posse. And so it's really a book about privileged exile, because I didn't have the stomach for a book which would deal with the actual horror. I couldn't see a way that anything I would write would do in any way be right, would deal with the suffering in a way that I thought was proper.
Just to remind all of you who are watching us live, please do let us know your questions for Colm Tóibín. We do have some questions coming in. This is a question from a viewer called Maud. She's asking, is The Magician more or less a straight biography, or is there an imaginative element in some of the facts and events? She says, I'm thinking of the Testament of Mary, which I love, and there's obviously a large imaginative element.
Yeah, I mean, my effort in the book is to create an illusion. So the illusion is that you eventually, after reading some pages, will enter into the mind and the spirit of Thomas Mann. You will have his memories, you will have his desires, and you will live within him. A biographer's job is really to provide an awful lot of clear information, and I suppose a sort of narrative drive. But what I'm interested in is the internal life of the reader as the reader experiences this material. Now, if I say that he was in Munich in a certain year, he was in Munich that year. If I say he was in America in 38, that's when he went to America. But obviously with the dialogue, I have no idea who was saying what when. The problem, how do you do dialogue in a different language 100 years later, and and when you weren't in the room? And so the dialogue is obviously entirely invented. But the relationships, he did have 6 children. He did marry in that year, so all of those factual things. He did live in the houses I say he lived in. So all of those factual things are, I hope, correct. I mean, the intention is to actually use a structure that is factual in order to create a building that is illusion.
Something that really struck me, and that I know a number of reviewers have commented on as well, is that he allowed, well, in the book, massive events in his life happen, and he doesn't make a big deal of it. Like that when he's talking about winning the Nobel Prize, it's almost just, by the way, and yes, and I did win it, and then it's not, you never feel him really being explosive about huge things that are happening. Yet there is, I found that was different when he was listening to music. It's almost like music stirred him in a way that the biggest of events of his life didn't. Did you feel that about him?
Yes, that I think it's something that in that creating of illusion, that I could get the reader to share with him that idea of being stirred up by music, first by symphonic music and later by chamber music, that really mattered to him. His inner life was somehow or other, it was animated greatly by that. But yes, you're absolutely right that other things don't matter to him as much. And but I had to be careful sometimes that I didn't want to write set pieces. So just trying to describe someone winning the Nobel Prize and going to Stockholm and all that business, it's really is a set piece. The problem we had in 1929 was that this Nobel Prize winning was going to make him a much larger target for the Nazis. He was going to become a very clear figure in opposition to them. So it wasn't as though he could come back to Germany in triumph and tour the country with this Nobel Prize in his hand. It was that he was actually coming back to a much more fraught, where his very name would mean more. So that was what I was interested in with the Nobel Prize question. But I think, yes, that his inner life is deeply private. He was introspective. And so that there's a huge amount of stuff going on within him all the time that's not necessarily being, I suppose, reflected in his speech. So my job is to attempt to create this inner life that might matter to the reader, that the reader might actually feel included in and also in a way implicated in.
He also famously drew on the facts of his life, his real life, and fictionalized them up to and including what happened with the musician Schoenberg. He creates a fictional character who creates the 12-point scale or whatever it is. That harvesting of real events from his life and fictionalizing them seems shocking to me anyway.
It seems to me that he was at his best when he was doing that. He was quite ruthless. In the first novel, Buddenbrooks, there's a portrait, for example, of his Aunt Elizabeth. It was Tony Buddenbrooks, who clearly is the most flighty. She gets married twice, but she's a great comic figure. She's got huge energy. I think everyone in Lubeck objected enormously to the book at the beginning because they saw a portrait of the city itself as a conservative place. In Dr. Faustus, he puts his mother into the book. He puts the suicide of both of his sisters into the book. In Death in Venice, he basically wrote down what happened, more or less. He's at his best, I think, when he's doing this. He had no problems about doing it. And of course, we see the same things happening in Virginia Woolf, where the death of her mother is the death of Mrs. Ramsay, is being used for that purpose. And certainly it's absolutely true with James Joyce. So it isn't an unusual thing to do. It's just that when we can see so easily him doing it because we've so much information about his own background and also about his marriage. And there's so many letters. But yes, that one of the things you can work with in a novel is just showing something happening and showing him writing it and showing how great the connection was. But I think more importantly, how great the ruthlessness was, that he really didn't bother him, that somebody might object or somebody might mind. And he used his own world, his own life as much as he did other people's.
So I think you may know that the Walter Scott Prize has a younger sibling, which is the Young Walter Scott Prize for writers aged 11 to 19. So if you had one piece of advice for these young writers, they might be tackling historical fiction for the very first time, what would be your top advice?
That you're not an historian, and that there are many historians, but there are probably fewer of you. And your job is to create the feeling, is to set the emotion, is to get the emotion right, is to get the motivation right, is to describe what light is like in a room. When she came into the room, where was the light? Where was the window? Was it there or there? that's not just, and that is an important moment because you're constantly involved in creating illusion, in creating the illusion that this happened and you were there. And that's not necessarily what an historian does. So you don't all the time have to fill in. If someone says, but you had nothing about what happened in 1874, and you said, no, it was too boring. I wanted to move on to 1875 because that's where the real drama was. So you're back with what Henry James said about what novelists have to do. He said you have to do three things: dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. And so ignore historians, use them for your own purposes, and then bring in the atmosphere, the feeling, make the reader feel, I was there, and I didn't know what was going to happen next. And then look what happened. And it was so strange.
That's fantastic. I read you were talking there about his diaries, that he would come home and say what he really thought in his diaries. It was just the almost 200th anniversary of the burning of Lord Byron's diaries. I had no idea that that happened. A month after he died, his friends all just burned his diaries.
Yeah, it happened with Philip Larkin as well. I think it's something sometimes that friends feel very loyal just to posterity. And Henry James burnt an awful lot of material. Thomas Mann burnt some diaries as well. So it's that strange business of thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be found out in the future or something like that.
But he put a date in the diary for being found out, didn't he? He actually said, my diaries may be published X years after I'm gone.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine the German scholars who thought that Death in Venice was a sort of metaphor, it was really about Europe and decay and beauty, and that he was exploring these issues in a sort of abstract way, giving them a sort of fictional treatment. But then when his diaries came out, they realized, well, and when Katya's memoir came out, that actually he was the father, he was that figure you can get in that Edwardian period. He was the father of 6 children who was also homosexual.
Are you allowed to tell us what you are working on now? I know people would love to know.
I mean, I'm trying to write a book, which is 25 years after Brooklyn, the novel I wrote. And so I promised I wouldn't do it. I hate sequels, except for Godfather 2, which I think is a good one. But generally sequels are a mistake. But I thought of something. I promised not to do it. And then I was walking down the street and I thought of something. And in other words, it's a whole new novel on its own, but it has the same characters as the original novel. So I'm working on that at the moment.
And can you let us know, we do have an awful lot of writers who follow the Walter Scott Prize, anything about your process? Do you plot, or do you just write and follow the characters?
I tend to structure very carefully. I tend to know what I'm doing with the structure, with overall what each section needs to achieve. But then as I work, something new occurs almost all the time. And sometimes you can't judge it until you write it. And you write something, you realize this is going to need something else now that I didn't think it did, because I put that emotion in, but I need an opposite emotion. I need something much clearer or else more ambiguous. And so as you're working, you're involved. It's not necessarily discovery as much as the constant solving of problems. That one sentence, in a way, each sentence or each paragraph causes a problem that the next sentence has to solve. And you've not to make this clear to the reader. This has to be all hidden and concealed. And so it's a strange process. You need, sometimes after a day's work, you think, yesterday I didn't know any of this. It's funny, by today it's all down on the paper, and so it's I mean, I do it in I do it, it's this is what it looks like.
Ooh,
this is what
longhand.
Yeah, longhand. Yeah, so so it's
and then do you type it up? Do you dictate it?
yeah.
How does it get into the machine?
No, I type it up. Typing it up is important because you get to live through it all again. You get to inhabit it all, be there again. I actually like making some of the letters. I like making a C. I like making a D. There's some letters I like making. So there's a sort of it's not exactly it'd be an exaggeration to say it's like being a calligrapher, but it's the pen is mightier than the sword.
You obviously your works are adapted for screen. When you're writing a novel, can you forget about the screenplay version of it ultimately and just lose yourself in the novel process, or is part of your brain alive to the fact that how will this look on screen?
I think you'd really lose it if you started to think, as you're working, who could Saoirse Ronan play this, or would it be much better if it were, Rooney Mara? In other words, your job is to get the thing down, and that you're dealing with a thing called the reader. And the reader plays as large a part in this as the characters do. You're trying to imagine all the time what the reader needs, what the reader needs to know, what the reader doesn't need to know here. And you also, the film business is much stranger than the noveling business, where it's most unlikely things get made as films, and things that seem obvious don't get made, and you can never judge that. So if you started pinning all your hopes on some book that's going to be made into a film, you found yourself disappointed, and so you'd be better not to put any thought into it at all. That's the only solution. Just don't think about it.
Don't think about it. Well, I'm so sorry to say we are out of time. I am most grateful to you for coming on to speak to us tonight. If you would like to know more about Colm's work, please do check out his website. And if you want to know more about future Walter Scott Prize author spotlights, follow this hashtag, or just go to our YouTube channel and subscribe, and you will find out what we are doing next. And what we are doing next this coming Thursday is speaking to author Amanda Smith, who has written this book set in 1920s Trinidad oil rush, a fantastic novel full of drama. So come along to that this coming Thursday night. Thank you so much again, Colm, for coming to see us, and I hope you have a good writing day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.